on the below the bundle of His or on the bundle branches, as opposed to a Mobitz type 1, which could be above the bundle of His. But what that indicates, the Mobitz type 2 is a more regular pattern. And that's why it indicates that it's a chronic issue. So you could have a 2-to-1, a 3-to-1, a 4-to-1 ratio, meaning that every second, third, or fourth QRS is dropped. So your PR interval will not change. It'll stay the same exact amount of time between atrial and ventricular depolarization. It's just that every third or fourth beat is dropped. So that is more likely to progress into a type 3 or third degree heart block, which is also called your complete heart block. And that's what's coming up next. Does anybody have any questions about the difference between Mobitz 1 and Mobitz 2 on your second degree? Yeah?
You said that every third or fourth beat, the QRS is dropped, right?
Yes, the QRS is dropped. Because the problem is not at the SA node, the problem is conducting that signal through the AV node and down through the bundle fibers.
So just because the difference between them is the location of where
So yes and no. It's partly the location, it's partly the severity. The difference that you can see to indicate how severe that block is, either partly because of the location or partly because of the severity of it, is going to be the pattern by which you see the second degree heart block. If you see any change in the PR interval, if it is lengthening immediately preceding that dropped beat, it's type 1, it's not as serious. It's actually something that's pretty easy to treat. Mobitz type 2 is a little bit more regular. The biggest complication is that sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between the two. So things like atropine, physical activity, even increased vagal tone or vagal stimulation, those are things that can induce the Mobitz type 1 block. So it can be used to kind of differentiate if you're having trouble being able to tell the difference between the two. And that could happen if, let's say, if you have frequent drop beats. It might be hard to see if there really is an elongation of that PR interval before you lose a beat because the drop beats are happening so frequently. So there are a number of different things that you can do to kind of separate them out, but what you're actually looking at is the pattern of the PQRST in order to understand which one is more likely to result in either progression of that heart block or intervention later on with an artificial pacemaker. Yeah?
you said every second, third, or fourth.
That was just an estimate. Like it's a regular pattern. So somebody with a type 2 could have a 2-to-1 ratio, which means they'll have 2 P waves and then a QRST and then
So
two.
it's never irregular dropping. It's always a consistent.
It's a consistent pattern for a Mobitz type 2. Yeah. For type 1, they could still be a pattern, but you will see that increase and it'll happen a little bit more sporadic. It could be a little bit more irregular. And you don't get a drop beat until you've extended that PR interval basically to its breaking point. Mm-hmm. Any other questions before we go into complete? All right. So what happens if you have a complete heart block? What does complete mean? Nothing's getting through, right? So what happens if nothing is getting through? No, you still are getting contraction, and you're still being able to generate the pressures enough so that you can open up the valves and pump blood. It's just horribly inefficient because effectively you have 2 different heart rates now. This figure is showing you that you have, wherever you see these P's, that is the regular interval of the SA node firing. So your P waves are stimulating the atrium to contract. Your QRS is much more spread apart. When you have a complete AV or atrioventricular block, anything coming from the atrium cannot pass into the ventricles. So if it can't pass into the ventricles are going to get stimulated by a new pacemaker, which could be any of the pacemaking cells at or below the AV node or into the Purkinje system. Okay, so first degree heart block, every P wave is followed by a QRS. It just takes longer for that signal to get into the ventricle. second degree type 1, every P wave to QRS, the distance gets progressively longer until you drop a beat. Mode type 2 is you have a constant, reliable PR interval with a steady sequence and pattern for dropping those beats. But type 2 means that you have some P waves that are followed by QRS and some that are not. Type 3 means you have regular P waves and you have regular QRS complexes, but they are completely disconnected. They're happening at their own rates. All right, I mentioned this before. Stokes-Adams is what would happen under a circumstance like this, where you have the ventricles basically escaping and starting to stimulate their own contraction. Normally, you have, the ventricles are used to being driven in terms of the timing of that depolarization from an atrial stimulus. So at this point, you get overdrive suppression when you basically lose that driving force of that electrical signal coming from the atrial and the atrioventricular node. The ventricles sort of stop for a second. And only after they start to activate a little bit more of that funny current to allow it to depolarize, to get to the point where it can be self-sustaining, then you get that ventricular escape and it will be a much, much lower heart rate. Why would the patient faint? Okay.
Cerebral blood flow.
Loss of cerebral blood flow, okay? So if your ventricle stops pumping, right, for anywhere from 5 to 30 seconds, you know, you have several beats per minute. If for half a minute your ventricle possibly isn't beating, you're going to lose blood flow to the brain and you can pass out from loss of cerebral blood flow. But ventricular escape allows AB nodal fibers or bundle fibers or Purkinje system to kind of kick in depending on where the block is. It would be distal to that block to allow for depolarization of the ventricles to maintain your life. Okay? So this is a figure, I think it's from Byrne and Levy, it says on the bottom. It just shows a little bit of the difference between first degree, second degree, and third degree. The first degree, everything is happening at regular intervals. You just have a long delay between P and R. The second one, not every P is followed by a QRS. And the third one is much more erratic. You have one heart rate for your atrium and another heart rate for the ventricles. That was the end of lecture 5 content. So does anybody have any questions before we go into hemodynamics? Yeah?
Are you going to say anything about how pacemakers work?
So typically pacemakers are inserted into the right ventricle in order to account for these types of heart blocks. So the SA node might not be an issue. If in these kinds of conditions, if you have a blockage with the conduction system, you don't have a problem with the atrium, you have a problem with the ventricle not responding. And so the connection into the right ventricle allows that to be stimulated on par with when the atrium gets stimulated.
So does it pick up the SA node rhythm and then just...
So depending on the way that they're connected is they get that signal to know when it's firing and then fires at a regular interval. Did I see that? Okay, guess I'm imagining. Okay, so we'll go into this. There we go. All right, so we're going to get into hemodynamics now. We've sort of, I don't want to say we finished the heart, but effectively we finished the heart part. Now we're going to talk about how the circulatory system works on today's Thursday, right? So Tuesday we'll talk about the microcirculation, the capillary beds, and then we'll get into how you regulate blood pressure and heart rate through a series of different types of receptors and feedback mechanisms. So today we're going to lead into what happens in the circulatory system. First off, your circulatory system branches out, starting with, if you're looking at systemic circulation, you're starting with the aortic arch, and it's gonna branch out into billions of little capillaries. What would you think are some of the features that would differ at each level of this branching? If you start at your aorta, and then you branch into large arteries, then smaller arteries, then arterioles, then capillaries, then back into venules, back into small veins, large veins, vena cava, until you get back to the heart. What are some of the changes that you would see in the structure and the overall function of the blood vessels as you change? Elasticity, radius of the vessels. Whether or not you get gas exchange, muscles. That's going to be really important, especially when we start talking about arterioles. The other part, aside from just resistance and pressure, is the overall cross-sectional area is going to change as you move through different levels. You want to have a very large cross-sectional area for your capillary beds because they're going to be the ones that are doing the grunt work of delivering oxygen and nutrients and picking up the waste products and carbon dioxide. So, sorry about that. I'm going to open this again. So, major functions. The biggest one is getting the oxygen and nutrients to the tissues of the body, okay? Or getting the blood to the lungs where it can do this other exchange to be able to provide for the tissues of the body. But, okay. There are some other features. Being able to transport hormones. Anybody who took endocrinology knows how important it is to have signaling between distant parts of the body that are not governed by nerves. So the blood doesn't just do its job of being able to feed the tissues of your cells, tissues of your body, or remove any of the waste products. It also has a job for communication between distal regions. So that's going to become really important when we start talking about the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, when we get into the renal unit, because it basically integrates a whole bunch of different parts of the body and collects all of these different molecules that are signaling and are communicated because they're circulated through the bloodstream. All right, so at the top of the next few slides, you're going to see questions, and you're also going to see answers to questions. So I'm not actually going to ask you them, but this is a good summary figure just to show you what the different components are. So I mentioned them earlier. Typically, your blood flow is going to be about 5 liters per minute. That's an average value for your cardiac output, okay? It can differ based on activity, it can differ based on overall health, it can differ based on age. It can even differ if you have a problem with directionality of your blood flow. So if we're saying that your cardiac output is 5 liters per minute, and we're going to calculate that based on your heart rate and the stroke volume per pump. That's assuming it's all going out of the heart, okay? There's a possibility that if you have regurgitation, not all the blood that's being pumped is going out of the heart. Okay, your stroke volume might be a certain value, but some of that could be regurgitated back. So on average, assuming everything is normal, 5 liters per minute of blood is getting out of your heart and into your body, whether it's to your pulmonary circulation or to the systemic circulation. It's the same for right and left. The difference is the pressure profile. So, aorta and arteries. Now, you know you have a few aortas, right? We're mostly talking about the aorta in terms of the aortic arch, but you also have abdominal aorta. So there's a figure I'll show a little later of what an aortic aneurysm looks like. It's actually showing the infrarenal abdominal aorta. So your thoracic cavity has your aortic arch and it has your thoracic aorta, and then you have 2 aortas down in the abdominal cavity. But the aortas and the arteries are able to withstand very high pressure. Okay? they're receiving the bulk of the blood that is coming out of the left side of the heart, going into the body. So it's an enormous amount of pressure because you have to be able to get it all the way out, overcoming that afterload, and then to be able to perfuse the entire body. Not every single blood vessel is open all the time. That's one thing that I didn't mention when we started talking about just the different pathways. When we get down to our capillary beds, and we talk about this in microcirculation, only like a quarter of your capillaries at any given time are open. So there are different reasons for that and different features that dictate whether one is going to be open or closed. But the bottom line is you have a lot of blood vessels, and just because you have them doesn't mean that all of them are going to be working and conducting blood at every moment. So, high pressure for your aorta and your arteries. Arterioles are your major source for controlling blood pressure going into the capillary beds. If you are going from a very high blood pressure, and then you're sending that into capillary beds are very fragile. They have a cell, right, an endothelial cell around that blood vessel. It's very, very small, like 3 microns, very little in radius. If you send blood in really forcefully under high pressure, what are you going to do to those capillaries? You're going to burst them, right? So how are you going to lower the pressure going in there? You're going to pass it through a massive resistor. All right, so it's the same thing when we talked about, when you guys talked about back in physics, your voltage, your current, and your resistance for Ohm's law. This is where it's going to come into play for our hemodynamics, okay? You pass it through a giant resistor, that resistor is your arteriole. So it's the major resistance to be able to control blood pressure and lower it sufficiently enough so that when the blood actually arrives at the capillaries, its pressure is down low enough that it's not going to damage the capillary bed. That doesn't mean that it's always going to stay the same value. When we get to the end of this lecture, we'll walk through how you can adjust the capillary pressure in order to increase or decrease the overall movement of fluid. Okay? But the capillary beds are where you have gas exchange, nutrient exchange, and the collection of waste products in order to take away what the tissue doesn't need anymore and give it a new, fresh supply. All of the venous side is going to return back to the heart. We're not going to go into too much detail about the specifics of this, but suffice it to say that when you are traveling against gravity, how are you going to ensure that the blood doesn't go back down? Valves. Okay? You do have valves that are in your venous circulation to make sure that the blood will go through there and continue moving up through. Okay? But there's a figure at the end that walks you through the lining of each of these types of vessels so you know what it looks like, what's involved in creating the functionality of each of these, if there's muscle cells, if they're the endothelial cells, if there's collagen or elastin. These, your veins are going to be very flexible. It's basically the reservoir. They can stretch a lot. These are going to take all of the stuff that you just collected in the capillary beds and it's going to fuel it back up to the heart so that it can go out into the next circulatory system. Once you get into the pulmonary side, that's your side of carbon dioxide and oxygen exchange. We have a whole unit on that, so we'll talk about how that works later. All right, this one I gave you beforehand, not because I expect you to memorize it, but because I wanted to point out that there are multiple different pathways for blood to get from the left side to the right side. There's only one pathway for blood to get from the right side of the heart to the left side of the heart. What pathway is that? Right to left. Pulmonary, right? Comes out of the right ventricle, goes to the pulmonary circulation, one capillary bed, and then it comes back to the heart. But as you can see here, there are many, many different ways that blood can pass through because you have multiple capillary beds. They also are going to be different, not just in structure, but also in function. So let's say you have one system where it's coming out of the ventricle. So let's go here. Oh, sorry, let me make little smaller. Make it red too. Coming out of here and passing through a single capillary bed before it comes back into the right atrium. Okay, so there's one option. Blood can come from the left ventricle to systemic circulation and pass through a single capillary bed before it goes back to the heart. You also can have a situation where it's going to pass through 2 capillary beds in series before it comes back. That's what we're going to talk about when we get to the renal unit. You'll have your glomerular capillary bed and your peritubular capillary. They are in series, so this is one of the unique points where once you have blood passing through a capillary bed, it's not necessarily going into a venule. It's going into another arterial, okay? So you can have it go through a single capillary bed, you could have it go through 2 in series, or you could even have it pass through in parallel. And then join again into the portal vein to go back in series. So multiple different ways that this can occur. Do you remember how to calculate the total resistance of series versus parallel? That's going to come up again in just a little bit, but I wanted to throw that out there because in this case, if you wanted to calculate the total resistance of the blood passing through the liver and the spleen, you have to remember that your mesenteric and your splenic capillary beds are going to be in parallel with each other, but both of them together are going to be in series with the portal capillary bed. Okay? So multiple different pathways to get oxygenated blood through the tissues and then back to the heart. But there's only one to go through the pulmonary circulation, one capillary bed in the lung, before it comes back to the left side. All right, so blood flow has to be controlled relative to the needs of the tissue. We'll talk about that when we get to regulation of blood flow, specifically in terms of which blood vessels are going to dilate or constrict based on the needs of the body. If you are under parasympathetic conditions, you want your blood flow to go to overall normal maintenance, right? Your rest and digest. If you're under sympathetic conditions, you need to send blood to your heart and also, to your coronary vessels that feed your heart, not just to your heart. And also to skeletal muscles, as well as to the parts of your body that you're going to be using under that particular circumstance, specifically in terms of breathing rates and also sweating and dilation of the pupils. Cardiac output will be controlled by tissue flow specifically. Okay? The pressure is going to be independent of where the blood's going and what the overall cardiac output is. The pressure itself is always going to be higher on the left and lower on the right. But you can determine the relative distribution of that blood based on the needs of the body. It's highly adaptable. All right, so when we get into blood flow, we're going to talk a little bit about laminar versus turbulent. Your blood flow is akin to which parameter in terms of Ohm's law? V equals IR. What would your blood flow be? I. What's your current? Okay? What's your voltage? Pressure. What's your resistance? Okay? So V equals IR is the same thing as pressure, in this case it's actually delta P, equals Q times R. Okay? So if you're solving for Q, you're specifically going to be looking at, okay, doesn't seem normal right anymore. There we go. Delta P over R. This will show up on a slide in a little bit. But this is Ohm's law for hemodynamics. We're going to expand on the resistance factor to take into account the radius and the viscosity of the blood in order to be able to see how that's going to affect resistance and therefore flow. But flow specifically is the amount of blood that's going to be passing through in a given unit of time. It's going to be predicated on the pressure of the blood that's flowing, as well as the resistance it has to pass through in order to continue moving. If you increase the resistance, what happens to flow? It would slow down if your pressure stayed constant. Okay? What happens if you increase your pressure difference between the 2 points? Assuming your resistance didn't change. The flow would increase. Okay? More pressure behind that flow will increase the rate that blood is flowing.
Will we be calculating these or?
No, you'll be calculating these. That's why I'm writing them. And putting them in boxes with a star. Okay, so yes, know this one, and then know the resistance one I'm going to get to in a second, which is the incorporation of the other parameters I mentioned for Poiseuille's law. All right, so 5 liters per minute, that's your cardiac output. That is the overall flow that is passing through the circulatory system. Okay, so see, right there. Q equals delta P over R. The pressure difference between 2 ends of the vessel divided by the resistance that blood has to pass through in order to make it through those 2 ends of the vessel. If you want laminar flow is nice and quiet. It's silent. You don't have any mixing of those layers that you see. Turbulence can happen because of an increase in very high amounts of pressure, very high velocity of blood flow. So you can see this turbulent, more inefficient movement of blood through the circulatory system. So if you have each layer that is staying basically in its own lane, like on a racetrack, everybody that is racing around in circles has to stay in their own lane. That's basically laminar flow. You can think of it as different sheets that are moving through that blood vessel. Turbulent flow will be if you have any one of these circumstances. So blood is coming in and it hits a bottleneck. Blood is moving over a rough patch. You have a plaque inside of a blood vessel. So now it's no longer going smoothly. It has to pass over a little barrier, or it has to go around a turn. All of these things are going to disrupt that silent laminar flow and create that more turbulent flow. And as I said before, high velocities would be one of the biggest indicators. Where are you going to see the highest velocity of blood flow coming through the circulatory system? Aortic arch. All right, so Ohm's law we did. I'll stick it here just again. Delta P over R. Poiseuille's law is a little bit trickier because it's going to incorporate this new value for resistance. Oh, come on. Hang on a second. Doesn't seem to want to write for me now. Let's do it in blue and see if that works. That is your new resistance value that will give you information about that particular vessel. It's going to take into account the length, which is that L on the end. It's going to take into account the radius of that vessel. It's also going to take into account that eta, after the 8, is your viscosity. The viscosity of the blood specifically moving through has to be taken into account. Because if you have blood that looks more like honey and less like water, it's going to move at a different rate. Okay? So if you were to stick that R value into Ohm's law, then you would get Poiseuille's law, which would be what? Q equals delta P, and then what? Pi R to the 4th over 8 eta L. Okay? So you don't necessarily have to memorize Poiseuille's law, but if you know Ohm's law and you know that resistance calculation, then you can figure it out. Poiseuille's law, surprisingly, does give us a good deal of information about the overall function of blood flow through the circulatory system, despite the fact that our blood vessels are not rigid cylindrical tubes. That's how it was originally identified. When they started going and creating these laws, he described it saying it applies only to constant velocity, no branching, no curves, straight, rigid tubes that can't change in size, they can't turn, and they are a constant radius. That's not reality for our hemodynamics, but this is actually quite applicable to give us a good idea of what's happening at any point throughout the circulatory system, even though it's not 100% one-to-one correlation across the entire circulatory system. All right, anybody have any questions about these? Yes?
Does the viscosity of blood change throughout your body, or is it constant?
So the viscosity of your blood will not change throughout your body. Like, you won't have it always more viscous in one part, less viscous in another, but it can change based on a number of different conditions, which we'll get to in just a second. All right, any other questions about this before we move on to the next part? Okay, so viscosity specifically, we're looking at, for lack of a better term, how slippery these two layers are against each other. The bigger the surface area, the more force you have to apply to one of those layers in order to get it to move. Okay? I'm not going to expect you to memorize this. This is just for those of you who had a little bit of fluidics to kind of connect maybe some of your physics class to what we're actually talking about here, specifically when we're talking about laminar flow. So your viscosity is going to tell you how slippery the blood is and how easy it is to pass in those laminar layers as it moves through the blood vessel. Normally what's going to happen is under laminar conditions, you see this sort of parabolic shape here. This guy, I'll delete this in just a second, but that shape, that's because the velocity with which blood is going to move in the interior portion, right in the center of that blood vessel, is going to be faster than the layers that are right next to the wall. Anybody know why? Friction, right? It's just going to move a little bit slower the closer you are to the wall and the endothelial cells of that blood vessel. When you are in laminar flow, that central red line is going to be the fastest velocity of flow. All right, so there is actually a nice little demonstration. It's about 2 minutes, but it shows you how you actually can have fluids moving together completely independently of each other without mixing in sheets, as you would see in laminar flow through the blood vessels. So they did this to make it easier to see with, I think it was corn syrup and different colors of corn syrup, but it shows you 3 different drops, and then they're going to twist it around and have those drops move. So you're going to see what looks like a lot of blending. And then when they go back in the other direction, you'll see what happens in laminar flow and why it doesn't actually mix.
Bring in red. Corn syrup dyed red. Now we're going to put in corn syrup dyed green. Now we're putting in blue corn syrup. All right, now we're going to rotate these fairly slowly, like 5 times. This is 1. Notice the flow is laminar, the relative number is less than 1. This is 2. This is 3.
Or is that burning it? All right, I'll stick with that one. Okay, so, oh, sorry. This is showing, that was just showing the laminar flow and the fact that when you have all of this blood moving in that silent pattern, it's not actually mixing. Despite the fact that you might think of blood just kind of flowing willy-nilly through your vessels, it is actually moving in a very organized fashion. Everybody's staying in their own lane, unless they hit a curve, a bend, a bump on the wall, okay? So the assumptions for laminar flow for your Poiseuille's law is indicating that you will have a steady rate of blood flow. You will have it in laminar conditions, that you won't have anything that causes turbulent flow. The viscosity is not going to change, and you can't compress that fluid, and the cylinder that you were sending it through, which is your blood vessel, is completely uniform. It can't stretch, it can't curve, it can't diverge into two different rows. But those assumptions, if you're looking at any small chunk of blood vessel, you can get an instantaneous measurement of flow based on meeting these rough conditions. Now, the Reynolds number is a dimensionless quality. It doesn't actually have a unit, but it does have an equation. So your Reynolds number, sorry, let me not write that sideways. Your Reynolds number is going to be 2 times the radius, the mean linear velocity, and the density of the fluid over the viscosity. Okay? So if you increase the viscosity of your blood, what happens to your Reynolds number? If you're keeping the same, everything else the same. Viscosity is in the denominator, it goes up, your Reynolds number is going to go down. What happens if you increase the velocity? Faster blood. You're going to increase the Reynolds number. There is a critical velocity with a Reynolds number value of about 2,000, at which the driving pressure and the flow, when they intersect, it converts from 100% laminar flow to the beginning of a mixed laminar turbulent flow. Okay, that's sort of your magic Reynolds number for the transition period between laminar flow and the point where you start to get turbulent flow. Doesn't mean it's all turbulent at that point. You don't usually hit completely turbulent blood flow until you get a Reynolds number of about 3,000. Okay, so 3,000 means that you're pretty safe bet that every blood that is flowing is under turbulent conditions. But at that 2,000 critical point, that's the transition between that linear relationship between an increase in driving pressure and an increase in flow, to the point where increasing your driving pressure doesn't necessarily have a 1-to-1 ratio to increase blood flow. Because now you've got blood radiating off the walls, moving around, it's moving too fast to be able to sustain that laminar flow. Okay, so Reynolds number of 2,000 is that beginning point where you start to see turbulence. Reynolds number of 3,000 means that pretty much all of your blood is turbulent. These are two different profiles. We already looked at this one to show what happens under laminar conditions. The laminar conditions give this more torpedo, okay? A little bit more point. Because you have a bigger difference in the velocity between the center of that vessel and the exterior part of the vessel. Once you get into turbulent conditions, it changes the shape because you don't have that same organization in the way that blood's flowing. When you start to introduce turbulent flow, now the higher velocity is now starting to interfere with neighboring sheets of that laminar flow, and you start to see a more dulled tip in terms of the way that the blood is moving through your blood vessels. All right, One thing that I also talked about before had to do with figuring out where blood was going to go in the heart. In terms of pressure, which direction does blood flow from? Low to high or high to low? High to low, right? You're going to flow from high pressure down to low pressure. In this condition here, you have blood that is flowing all the way through this cylinder here that has pressure values showing at 100, then 90, then 80. Same diameter. You still have blood flowing in this direction when the pressure goes from 100 down to 60 and up to 80. So the question I want you to take a second and think about is, how can it flow from a pressure of 60 to a pressure of 80 if blood should be flowing from a high to low? You guys can talk to me.
So it's going to low high instead of high to low? Is that the question?
I think so.
What did you say?
I didn't try to word it.
Okay, it's gonna. She said, how's it connected to blood flow?
Probably.
Blood flow?
Right.
All right, about 30 more seconds.
It's going against the current.
The resistance on this.
It's like physics.
Yeah.
Did you answer? What's that? Did you answer?
All right,
I just not prepared.
let's see what we got here. All right. Change, kinetic. Very good. The velocity is changing. Okay, the biggest difference that we have here is that you are changing the pressure. Okay, you are changing this. And you're going from high to low to kind of in between. Okay, but what else is changing? Your velocity is changing, which means your kinetic energy is changing. Okay, so if this is also changing, no, it's not going to do that. Sorry about that. That's the big key player here. It's the conversion of your pressure or your potential energy that you have is being converted into kinetic energy. So if you look at the total energy, the actual value is doing exactly what we thought it was going to do. It's going to go from 100, I guess I just can't write down here at the bottom. So 100 to 92 to 82. That's down here at the very bottom of this figure. You are actually going from a high total energy to a lower total energy. Because even though you're decreasing the overall radius, you are increasing the kinetic energy. So you're converting some of that potential to kinetic energy. Okay? So that's just looking at, yes, we are moving from high pressure to low pressure, but you have to take into account the velocity with which your blood is going to flow through different types of blood vessels as well. And the rate at which blood is going to flow, especially if you have high velocity blood, you can have a lot of issues for damage to your blood vessels because of turbulent flow. This is the figure I mentioned before that's showing your infrarenal abdominal aorta, that enlarged portion below the kidneys, that is your aortic aneurysm. Typically, the aneurysms are going to be asymptomatic. They're not really going to have an issue. You're not going to have much of an issue until they rupture, okay? But it's a weakened wall of that aorta because of all the turbulent flow, high pressure, high velocity, lots of turbulence. It damages or weakens the vessel wall. So that enlargement is because of a weakened wall, and it does have the potential to be ruptured, especially if you happen to get, kicked in the butt. Okay? I hope doesn't happen, but you never know. Atherosclerosis, anybody know what that is? Hardening because of what? Plaques, okay? You have the deposition of stuff, okay? Any type of fatty deposits, lipid deposits that can happen on the inside of your blood vessels. How does that introduce turbulence? Rough surface, right? You get laminar flow as long as the outermost layers, which are almost not moving, but they're very, very slow, they're moving along a smooth surface. If they hit a bump in the road, they're going to now interfere with the next layer, which is going to introduce that level of turbulence. So turbulent flow can cause a severe damage to the overall blood vessels. All right, so going from flow, looking at pressure now. Your blood pressure, typically, we're going to talk about millimeters of mercury here. When we get to respiratory, we'll talk about centimeters of water. They're both used, but centimeters of water is used a little bit more regularly with the respiratory physiology. We still pretty much use the millimeters of mercury. But I have the conversion down there at the bottom so that when you see this again in the respiratory unit, it'll be 1 millimeter of mercury is about 0.136 centimeters of water. So, if we're going to look at pressure, how is pressure going to be related? Pressure is going to be equal to, pressure will be equal to what? PQR, right? Just like the alphabet. P equals Q times R. Okay, so your flow times the resistance. So the resistance of that vessel is going to have a big indicator on what the pressure is moving through that vessel. Okay? When we get to the arterioles, you're going to see just how much a rapid increase in resistance is going to have an effect on the pressure. So if resistance is going to impede blood flow, you get that by taking whatever the change in blood pressure is from the beginning to the end of that vessel that you're measuring, divided by the amount of flow. So that will give you your resistance value. How else do you get resistance? 8. L divided by pi r to the 4th. Okay? Radius to the 4th power. So small changes in radius have massive changes in resistance. Okay? R to the 4th in that denominator. So if you really decrease the radius, even if you decrease it just a little bit, what's that going to do to the resistance? Increase or decrease? Increase it, right? If it's 8 beta L divided by pi r to the 4th, r is the denominator, and it's also to the 4th power. So a small decrease in the radius can have a big increase in the overall resistance. That'll come into play when we talk about arterioles. Okay, quick review, parallel and series. How are we going to add them together? Series is easy. Just add up all the resistors. As long as they're in series, you just add the numbers and you're good. If they're in parallel, it's 1 over the total resistance is equal to the reciprocal of every single one of the resistors in parallel. And that will give you your actual total resistance. Okay? So that's physics review. Why do we care about parallel? So that different tissues can receive blood to suit their needs. If everything were in series, part of it would be that once the blood passes through that first capillary bed, it's basically sucked up all the nutrients, right? There's not going to be as much left in the second capillary bed. But it also means that you can divert blood to these different parallel arrangements so that certain organs can get a higher level of blood flow than other organs, depending on need. So that goes back to the different patterns that you have for how you are going to have blood coming through. When we get to the kidneys, there's actually a very important reason why you have those two capillary beds that are in series. The purpose of the first one is just to filter out the blood. The purpose of the second one is actually to reclaim into the blood stuff that was soaked in. Okay? So there is a purpose for having that anatomical arrangement. All right, inductance, by definition, is the inverse of your resistance. Okay, so if it's going to be the inverse of your resistance, what would conductance be? Over, right? Because it's 1 over the resistance. And resistance is the inverse of that, okay? It's telling you basically the measure of that blood flow for any given pressure difference, that is how much blood is flowing through that resistor. So this shows you what happens if you change, if you have the constant blood pressure. So here's your pressure, okay? But you are now having a situation where you have 3 different diameters, okay? The smallest one on the top that is about half of what's in the middle, and the one on the bottom is twice what's in the middle. If you were to look at the relationship between the radius and the blood flow is what we're looking at over here on the right. You see that a relatively small change happening in the radius can have big consequences in the rate at which blood is flowing through. And that's mainly due to the fact that radius is to the 4th power, okay? The other part that was highlighted in the previous one, on the bottom there, is that eta, that's in blue. Eta, again, is your viscosity. So somebody asked before about how viscosity can change. You can have your normal hematocrit level. Gives you a set viscosity if your hematocrit's around 40, 45. If you're anemic, so if you have, for some reason, hemolytic anemia, you're losing red blood cells, you don't have as high a hematocrit, what does that mean for your viscosity? Up or down? Down, right? So because of that, you have a drop in the number of cells that are present, so more of your blood is actually made up of liquids, which means it's going to flow a little bit more like water and less like food. Polycythemia means that you have an abundance of red blood cells. You could see this if you go to high altitudes after you've adapted for a long time. You can get a higher production of hemoglobin and also a higher production of red blood cells in order to accommodate for the fact that you don't have as much oxygen at very high altitudes. So you can tend to see, if you're up there for a long period of time, you can tend to see some polycythemia. There are other pathological conditions. This is the one that I hope most of you are more likely to come into contact with, for a reason why you would see an increase in the number of blood cells. What's that going to do to your viscosity? It's going to raise it, right? More cells, less liquid, more like honey or corn syrup, less like water. So it's going to increase the overall viscosity. So when your hematocrit goes up, which is down here on the bottom, your viscosity of the blood goes up, and your resistance also goes up. So if you look at these, the chart on the right, the hematocrit's on the x-axis, the viscosity is on the y-axis, and in blue you have the viscosity of water. It's not changing because there are no cells. The viscosity of your plasma, it's not taking into account any of your red blood cells or white blood cells. It's just looking at the actual liquid component, plasma of your blood, so it stays relatively constant too. Once you look at whole blood, the higher the hematocrit, you see it's not a linear relationship. Once you get to very high levels, it's going to have a drastic increase in the viscosity, which means it's going to move a lot slower because it's going to have a massive increase in the overall resistance, even at the same diameter. So diameter of the blood vessel should be the ideal way to change resistance. But if you happen to have a change in viscosity, that also can elevate your resistance. All right, so biggest drop is happening in your arterial. What this figure is looking at is each vertical column just tells you the different branch of circulatory system, starting with the aorta for the systemic side and then going into the pulmonary side. This is your pressure profile. So you see the highest pressure is starting at the aorta and the large arteries, and you see a little bit of a drop when you move down to the small arteries, but your largest drop is happening here in the arterioles, okay? These are your major resistance vessels. They're capable of adjusting their resistance so much that as blood passes through there, it loses a lot of the pressure. So by the time you get down to the capillaries, it's at a much more manageable value, okay? You don't see as big of an increase when you get over to the pulmonary arteries because that's the lower pressure part of your circulation. All right, so largest pressure drop is present in your arterioles. On the right, this one I believe comes from the boron book. On the right, you have a few different parameters here. The ones I really wanted to point out was the relationship that you see between cross-sectional area and the velocity. As the cross-sectional area goes up, and we're talking about aggregate cross-sectional area of all of the vessels at that level. So all capillaries, right? You go from one aorta out to like billions of capillaries, okay? So lots of surface area also corresponds to the lowest velocity, okay? On the bottom, when we're looking at the actual pressure value, down here, it really doesn't want to draw on the bottom. So this bottom one here, you see that you have the fluctuation of the pressure on the left-hand side that is relatively high because that's starting from your systemic circulation. You see that significant drop here, right at the point that is correlating to the arterial up at the top. So you can read it better when you look at it in the textbook, in the boron book. But if you look closely, that biggest pressure drop is happening at the arterioles. That's the biggest point where you are slowing down that velocity because of that massive resistance. So kind of a zoomed in look shows that same drop. That same drop is showing up right here within the arteriolar region. Biggest decrease that you see in pressure. You don't see as big of a one in the pulmonary circulation, basically because you're not starting at such a high pressure. You do still see a drop, but it's a little bit more gradual slope. All right, the last part that I want to talk about is how your capillaries can change in pressure based on what's considered your precapillary arteriolar resistor and your postcapillary resistor. So at the junction between your arterioles and your capillaries, you're passing through the resistor and the arteriolar vessels, right? When you're passing through, after you get out of the capillaries, you're going to pass through another resistance going into the venule system. You'll have a pressure, a blood pressure on the arteriolar side. You'll have a pressure on the venule side. Are these in series or parallel? They're in series, okay? So as long as you are not changing the overall total resistance of the system, you can have reciprocal changes in the pre and post resistance on either side of the capillary. It's going to affect what pressure you see in that capillary bed, which has the consequence of affecting how much exchange of fluid happens in that capillary bed. Okay, that's sort of in the purview of Tuesday. We're going to introduce it here. So, right here, we're looking at 60 at the arteriole, 25 millimeters of mercury in the capillary, and 15 in the venule. This is about normal because the ratio of the post-capillary resistance to the pre-capillary resistance is less than 1. It's typically for normal capillaries, you're looking at about a ratio of 0.2, 0.4, somewhere around there. So it's almost always less than 1. So which is capillary bed closer to? Closer to the venule system, right? So you have a much bigger pressure drop between 60 and 25 than you do from 25 to 50. But you're still passing through another resistor. So the capillary is still going to be at a higher pressure than the blood entering into the venule because you are going to pass through another resistor. On the bottom, it's just showing you how you could actually calculate the pressure in the capillary. That's what your PC is. That's the blood pressure that is inside of the capillary. Okay? It's not the average of the arteriolar and the venule. You can't just take the two, average them, and come up with the capillary pressure. You have to take into account the ratio of the resistance, okay? And you do that by taking the post to pre ratio times the arteriolar, and then adding that to the venule pressure. Then you divide that whole thing by 1 plus the post to pre. I'm not gonna have you calculate this, but I like equations. It helps me to kind of visualize things, and I know we have a couple people who do like math and equations, so I put this up specifically to give you a frame of reference. What you do need to know is how precapillary and postcapillary resistors affect the pressure inside of the capillary bed. Okay, so you can use this equation to calculate it if you want, or if you just want to remember that if you increase the arteriolar side, the precapillary resistor, you're going to have a PC that's closer to PV. If you decrease the arteriolar resistance, you're going to have a higher capillary pressure before getting into the venule system. Okay? So on the off chance here that it shows normal at the top, and if you make that change where you are increasing on the post side, what happens to this value compared to what it was before? What was it before? It was 25, right? So what happened? It went up, okay? So if your ratio shows that you have a lower resistor before the capillary compared to the after one, so your ratio of post to pre is greater than 1, the pressure inside the capillary is going to be higher. How would you get a lower pressure of blood leading into the capillary? What would you do in order to make sure the pressure would be a little higher? You would dilate the arteriole, right? If the arteriole is your resistance vessel and it increases resistance by decreasing the diameter, if you dilate it, you're not going to have as big of a pressure drop. So basically, instead of going from 60 down to 25, now you have 60 going down to 40. Now this is assuming that you are keeping the total resistance the same, and you're just fluctuating on either side. Okay? So it shows it down on the bottom that you can either increase the post or you can decrease the pre. Typically what you're going to do is you're going to modify the arteriolar resistance because that is the most sensitive to changes for sympathetic stimulation. How do we feel about this so far? Okay, what happens if you greatly constrict the arteriole? Now what do we have? What was it, the first, the normal? Okay, so if you ramp up the pre-resistor, which is more likely, or you happen to decrease the post-resistance, you'll see in just a little bit why it's much more likely that you will affect the arteriolar side. If you were to ramp that up, that means that that blood entering the arterioles is going to pass through a bigger resistor, which means you're going to have a larger pressure drop. The pressure of the blood arriving at the capillaries is now going to be lower and more similar to what you see on the venule side. We care about this because changes in the actual pressure at the capillary, this is going to be something called hydrostatic pressure. All right, so your hydrostatic pressure is going to be one of the forces that promotes fluid movement from blood into the tissues. So if you have a higher capillary pressure, it'll move more fluid into the tissues. If you have a lower capillary hydrostatic pressure, it'll move less fluid into the tissues. Okay? So we care about the relationship between the resistors on either side of the capillary bed because it will give you information about how much fluid, nutrient, and gas exchange are going to happen at that particular capillary bed. It'll also dictate whether or not those capillaries are open. All of this is going to be covered on Tuesday. Okay? So this is our first introduction to that. How do we feel so far? good? Remember, you don't have to calculate, okay? It's just to give you a frame of reference. All right, this figure is also from the boron book, and it shows you the difference between what happens if you have a normal tone of the arterioles, or if you happen to dilate or constrict. So what we have here is purple. The purple curve shows what's happening for dilation, and the green shows what happens under constriction. If you constrict the arterioles, constriction means what for radius? Smaller. Smaller radius means what for resistance? Higher. Higher resistance means what for pressure drop? Bigger, right? You're passing it through, starting at the same point at the top. If you're starting at the same value here, and you constrict the arterioles, you're gonna have a larger drop in pressure because you are passing that blood through a bigger resistor, simply by the fact that you've constricted that vessel. If you dilate the arteriole, now you have a larger radius, a larger diameter. What does that mean for the pressure drop? It's going to be less. You're still starting at the same point, but now you have less of a drop. So the big difference between these two is the value that you see in the capillary. Those are different pressure values that you can see in the blood passing through the capillaries under conditions of constriction or dilation of the arterioles. So purple line is dilation. You see that that means that blood going through the capillary is going to be under a higher pressure. The green line shows constriction, smaller radius, bigger resistor, bigger pressure drop. So the pressure entering the capillaries there is going to be lower. Good? Anybody have any questions on this before I do the last slide? Okay, so why do the arterioles do a much better job than the venules? It has to do with what they are made of. Move that cursor out of the way. On the left, you have your aorta, and then it moves in progressively smaller vessels. What we're really looking at on the left here for this chart down below is we're looking at endothelial cells, which every single one is going to have because it's just the endothelial cells that line your blood vessels. So all of them are going to have it. You have elastic fibers. Elastic is going to be better at stretching than your collagen fibers. So if you have a highly elastic vessel, it's going to be much more flexible. Collagen is still stretchy, but it provides a little bit more strength. Okay, so it's still flexible, but it provides more stability. So you have that to reinforce the aorta, but you also have it in the vena cava. A lot more of it in the vena cava for your collagen. You notice you have a lot of elastic fibers present in your aorta because it needs to accommodate large influxes of blood. Large influxes of volume of blood. The biggest one that I want to point out, specifically in terms of affecting resistance, has to do with smooth muscle. You don't have any here, and I don't want to say, I'll say yes and no, for venules. These muscle cells are, it's vascular smooth muscle cells, VSMC. That's the abbreviation if you ever see it in the text. Your vascular smooth muscle cells can be in a very thick ring around the vessel, so you see that specifically in arterioles and in precapillary sphincters. Sphincters function to close off those capillaries so that they cannot have any blood going through them, which is necessary. So they have a very thick, smooth muscle. But of all of the regular blood vessels in your circulatory system, the biggest one that is susceptible to hormonal changes and neuronal changes would be your arterioles because of this thick layer of smooth muscle. Okay? You don't have smooth muscle cells in a continuous layer around the venule. That said, it doesn't mean you don't have it, okay? For simplicity, it shows that you don't have it. That's not 100%. You have what's called discontinuous vascular smooth muscle cells. So there will be some sporadic vascular smooth muscle cells on the outside of venules within your circulatory system. It's just not a constant coating. It's, for your arterioles, it effectively is like the insulation of a wire. It coats the entire thing. It's a pretty thick layer. And when it's stimulated, it can constrict and it can dilate. So you get a great deal of control. You have a little bit of control on the venule side, not as much. But you do have a little bit of control, which is why you can increase or decrease the post-capillary resistance. All right. Hemodynamics. Any questions?
Does that mean there's minimal innervation of the venules by?
It's not as much, but yeah, they will still respond to local tissue hormonal changes as well as environmental changes for like electrolytes, gas, acid base balance. They'll respond to that as well, but not nearly as much.
Yeah, we were going over heart blocks.